the Canadian Association. Oh, I just got the recording is in progress. So here we go. Nora is the editor of the Canadian Association of Labor Media. She is a sought after facilitator and presenter, and she writes regularly for magazines, newspapers, and online. Nora is the author of the upcoming book, Spin Doctors: How Media and Politicians Misdiagnose the COVID-19 Pandemic, as well as the book, Take Back the Fight: Organizing Feminism in the Digital Age. So tonight, Nora will be talking about strikes and the media. And so if you have some questions that you're really hoping that Nora's going to talk about or address, then please put those in the chat and we can share them with Nora. And otherwise, please use your emojis or turn your cameras on, do a wave hello, and join me in welcoming Nora.
Hey, hi everybody. As I said, I know there's been people joining for that introduction. Thank you, Orvi, for that. I am joining you from the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat Nation. Quebec City was also a gathering spot for many nations across Eastern Canada, what is now today Eastern Canada and Northern United States. I have to first say, my solidarity is with you all. Whoever came up with the bison running off of the logo of the university was a genius. I loved that. And when I was a kid, my parents were on strike for 6 weeks, and then they were on strike for 3 months. And it was really hard. It was really, really hard. I was 14 years old. I imagine there's a lot of you that have kids. And it really affected our family in such a positive way. Even though my parents couldn't afford my uniform at the time. I was in the public Catholic system in Ontario. My uniform was garbage because I had to put something together that they couldn't pay for. But even then, it was really, really important. And so the work that you're doing is so important. It's important for you. It's important for your community. And it's important for the generations of people that will have your jobs in the future. And so thank you very, very much. I said that I would like to hear what people's concerns are. I want to start off with those concerns because this presentation, it looks at the constraints that journalists operate under that make it feel like for those of us who are trying to have working people's message get into the press is impossible. And when you add on top of that professors who are great people, who are maybe a little verbose, maybe who focus on an area that is so super important, like the most important thing in the world. But sometimes the average person doesn't really understand cyanobacteria as much as you do. And so trying to figure out from your academic mind, academic world, working with students, trying to think of your own field to the world of journalism and media, which is also sometimes full of folks who are a little bit academically illiterate. It can be very, very scary. And so I want to decode that for you. And I want to make you feel not just like you understand how things work, but also that you have the capacity and power to change things. My presentation will be made available. And if it's the case that we run out of time, this is why I'm going to do the presentation in a second, kind of after we get through these questions. You'll be able to read it and understand what my points are. They're not like bullet points that make no sense. So even if we run out of time, we will get the most of what you're here hoping to learn tonight. So the first question, sense of how using the media is a standard employer anti-union tactic, and how unions have been able to both weather that form and fight to get their message across regardless. Yes. Okay, so there are a lot of things that work against the favor of working people from the press. One of them is that the press is owned by people who do not want to hear about wages needing to go up. They certainly don't want to hear about classroom sizes. It's boring. They really don't want to hear about anybody who's doing service work, right down from people working in the services industry, like retail workers, all the way through, of course, to professors. And the university knows this. They have professional communications staff. Your union does as well, but the kind of people that work in those positions are a little bit different, and they understand that they have an advantage, right? The playing field is in their favor because journalists are really bad at covering labor issues. They look at a labor issue often from the lens, either, if you're lucky, they're looking at it from both sides. Okay, so that means, each side has totally legitimate grievances, even if that's not true. That's if you're lucky. But by and large, when you're talking to someone from the Winnipeg Sun, who's owned by Post Media, who's owned by an American hedge firm and an American Republican activist, it's not that easy to get your message out. However, what you have on your side, you have a lot on your side, actually. You have the fact that you play a critical role within society. And in that role, you have a community of people. You've got students that you're in contact with every day. You are anchored members of community research groups or activism in different ways, or you're creating knowledge, which is really, really important in a city like Winnipeg. You're creating local knowledge that's allowing people to navigate the world, whether or not that knowledge is local to Winnipeg or whether it's global knowledge. It's still really critical. And you also are very sympathetic, right? And so journalists love the underdog, even if their bosses don't. So you always have to think of, how do we use this underdog approach? Now, for professors, it can be a bit difficult because people aren't going to look at someone with tenure and a good salary and good working conditions if we're going to compare it to someone who's working, 80 hours a week as a cashier. So you have to then explain to journalists what the context of all of this is. And you have to find ways to make it understandable for average people and not get too worried that you just can never get a fair shake. At a newspaper like the Winnipeg Free Press, which is independently owned, they're unionized workers as well, and they know very, very well what a labor battle looks like. They also know very well what bad management looks like. You can actually talk to them in language that they'll understand, because you actually have very similar struggles with your employers. So that's a bit of strategy that the union and your communications committee, I'm sure, has had conversations of. But as members, if you are ever walking down the street and a journalist sticks a microphone in your face and says, "Have you heard about the strike at the University of Manitoba? What do you think?" And you say, "Well, actually, I'm on strike. I'm a member," then you should be prepared with those kind of quick talking points about, what is this strike over? Why is it important? And not just why is it important for you personally or the union, but why is this important for the community that you serve? Okay. We noticed a distinct lack of press coverage at our rally. What's up with that? Are we being punished, or are they tired of us? And I mean, hey, you might not know who I am. I'm blacklisted from the Canadian press. So I totally understand, not the Canadian press, like capital C, capital P, but the media establishment. So I get it. Why are they not at your rally? I'm going to go through some of this in the presentation, but what you have to keep in mind is that a lot of journalists see rallies in and of themselves as not news, because they're just an event, right? Just like they wouldn't cover a tea social or a talk or something like this. They might just see it as an event, even though for you've been organizing and mobilizing for it. So you have to create these events as media opportunities. Did you have a press conference before it? Is there something else that you're competing with? Was there breaking news? Because if there's breaking news, doesn't matter how big your rally is. It doesn't matter what's going on. If someone important dies, if something happens, that's out of your control. So your events actually have to be strong enough to withstand breaking news. And if journalists don't come, that's not the end of the world. It's not a failure. Are you being punished? I mean, if the Winnipeg Sun isn't there, maybe. If CBC isn't there, what you should be looking at is the journalists who are writing about the strike and saying, "Hey, why didn't you come?" And they'll tell you probably, "Oh, I couldn't convince my editor it was important." Okay, so then you have to ask yourselves, how do we make these events important? Are you doing something that has an impact beyond the campus in your rallies? Or is the rally just located to campus? You might want a rally that's located to campus because you might want to make sure the campus knows about it. But then there might be a trade-off with telling people in the broader community. Maybe you hold a rally that's so close to the CBC that they're going to fall over your rally. That's a tactic to maybe get people to show up. But you're probably not being punished. They're probably not tired of you. But as I say, the playing field is not even. So you always have to look at this as, what is the media hook? What am I going to get this journalist to convince their boss, who has to convince their boss that this is more important than, I don't know, the day's business numbers or whatever else they might cover? Concerns about a relationship going forward with the administration, given the misleading communications they have been releasing. Do you have any perspective on the use of these communications? Yes. So a strike is a moment of a lot of intensity and a lot of very difficult emotions. And I know a lot of faculty unions that have gone through a very vicious and divisive strike, finding it very difficult to mend those relationships with management later on. This is something that, this is why the union is really important, because the union doesn't necessarily need to have harmonious relationships. And so you should figure out as an individual what's that boundary between where you can go with your management and where are you comfortable and where are you not comfortable. And where you're not comfortable, then you let your union do that work for you. And then you're like, you'd be at a meeting with your dean or with your chair if they're out of the union. I'm not sure if that works at your school, and be like, oh yeah, the union, I don't know, right? You don't have to wear everything. The union is there to do that. They're like, this barrier between you and the people you have individual relationships with. But for the union, that's a tactic that management puts forward as saying, you're going to ruin this relationship. This is going to get really difficult for you. And then the union is like, oh my gosh, we feel pressure for that. And you have to really figure out internally how to resist feeling pressure for that. And, people remember, right? I know folks who are still bitterly angry at York University for having read their emails during one of their strikes, right? I'm talking not the last one, not the one before that. And so, yeah, it's the relationship, it's going to evolve, but the sad reality of industrial relations is that, it's not always friendly, but that's the union's job. And so allow the union to be in that position and to be the bad guy if you have to kind of be the good guy in your day-to-day work. I used to have respect for journalists, but during this strike, I've been disappointed with the coverage, but also of COVID-19, however, on many topics in the US. How has the media and journalism changed as it is monopolized and brought by the corporate interests? Okay, I have a book coming out about this topic. So the only thing that I will say about that is you can buy my book at Robinson McNally. I know that they've got copies of it. It's coming out on Wednesday of next week. But yes, the pandemic has also been very disappointing to me as well. The thing I think is important to keep in mind that journalists, the lowest rung of journalists, they are often contractless, precarious. They don't even have their corporate email sometimes because they're being hired as a subcontract. CBC is the worst for this. People are strung along on these contracts, and it's really, really bad for them. Canada lost 3,000 journalists during this pandemic. The CBC was given $0 to report on this pandemic. Zero. They gave Rogers $120 million through the wage subsidy. CBC got nothing because they were not eligible for the wage subsidy because they're a crown corporation. And so I think that we have to look at the good things that are coming out of the pandemic in journalism. And also outside of journalism too, as academics. I think that we've seen academics take a real activist role in the pandemic that we have not seen before. This is really good because epidemiologists and infectious disease experts and doctors and sociologists, they're coming out and being loud about their expertise. And that is what we need more of. We need more of that public intellectualism. And that comes sometimes at the expense of journalism because there's just not enough journalists doing the job. So for a whole 450 pages more on that topic, you can check out my book. Orvi, are there any other questions or is that it?
I see that Susan has her hand raised. Susan, did you want to ask your question?
Sorry, I don't have a question.
Oh,
sorry,
okay.
I don't know how I did that.
That's okay. That's
maybe to say hi.
Yeah, I think Nora, you can launch on in.
Awesome. Okay. So this is a very truncated version of a media relations presentation that I often give. The last time I gave it was to the University of Regina Faculty Association, actually. And so I don't get into the mechanics of how to do an interview. If you want that, I can give your union executive the slides. You can all look at it, and you can have some tips on how to practice. But I intentionally do not talk about that because it's just a little bit too far outside of what we're talking about tonight. And it isn't to suggest that you aren't all doing media, but there's a lot of folks on the call, and I suspect a lot of you haven't spoken to journalists. So what I thought was most interesting was to talk about how we think media works, how media actually works, who owns what, and the things to keep in mind when you're looking at coverage or when you're asked to intervene. So let's see if this works. Oh, I should maybe share my screen before I go to my slides. Okay, you can all see that. See my presentation? Yes, good. Not you don't see like my podcast editing stuff, which is just underneath this. That would be a lot more.
It looks really great.
Okay, awesome. Okay. And then Orvi, stop me if there's questions or anything as we go along, because I will otherwise just kind of give her. Okay. Oh, God, no. Okay, I'm going to try to just get rid of that little background text because that those dots are really bad on the eyes, and I see that. I have an old version of Keynote, and it sometimes keeps dots when I transfer it from one thing to the other. Great. Let's see if that works. How do you like that? Better than the dots. Okay. So this is how we think media works. Journalists choose stories, or sometimes they have stories assigned to them, right? That the idea that, do they hate us if they're not writing about us? Once they get the story, they head to the location, to the rally. They talk to both sides. They record some quotes, and they write a story that answers the 5 W's, like who, what, where, when, and why. Have quotes from either side, maybe some other officials to make sense of the whole issue, and they'll write as long as they need to get the relevant article information into the article, right? We also think that, for us to get media, we send the press release to the journalist, the media outlet. We have something that is really, really great, cool, that they really want to come to. They're going to show up at our event because it's super important. And then the story appears with the aforementioned elements. It doesn't work like that. And as media concentration gets more and more intense, it really doesn't work like that anymore. And I have to say, like, I know it probably doesn't feel like you folks are in a special location with the Free Press, but you really are. If you compare the Free Press to even Le Devoir, which is a very stand-up daily independent newspaper, I mean, it's like this compared to this. Like it's a really good independent newspaper, which doesn't matter when you're angry at the coverage. So this is how it really works. Journalism relies heavily on wire services. So they rely heavily on receiving information through wire services, which is then fed through by Market Wire or CNW Group or Cision or whatever. And these are places where you have to pay to play. And even if you pay and place your press release onto the wire services, it doesn't actually mean that a decision is going to be made, that they're going to cover this. This is especially the case for the Globals, the CTVs, and the local radios of the world, because all of them have broadcast centers that are not Winnipeg. And so they're going to be made by, their decisions are made by people that, I mean, might not even know that the university exists. They hide that really well, though. So you might watch the local news and it feels really local, but more and more decisions are fully being outsourced to Toronto. And then you've got the Canadian Press, and the Canadian Press is a national wire service. The Free Press is a member, the CBC is a member, Global CTV, they're all members. And the Canadian Press, if they write an article, it might run on all of these platforms, but it's national. And so it's very unlikely that your strike is going to get on the Canadian Press, even if it's like a monumental strike. It's because it's not national news in the perspective of the Canadian Press. And where that becomes important is that it takes up a lot of space in news media. And so if they've got 5 pages for news and 3 of those pages are taken up from the Canadian Press, that means that you are really only competing for 3 pages of space, even though if you read through the newspaper, there's much more than that. So things are really compressed. And then there's iNews, which all of the news rooms that are subscribing to iNews, they have access to the news wire. That's what it's called if you ever hear about the news wire. It's not wire services, it's the news wire. And the news wire will tell journalists, this is breaking news, this is what's important. And so they'll literally sit there and stories will break across the wire, and their job, think of CBC Online, and they'll be like, oh, Here's a story. Here's a story. They'll pull it off the wire. They'll rewrite it a little bit, and then that's their radio story. That's their television story. That's their online story. Again, if you're not getting your news into iNews, then you're competing with an entirely invisible and crowded news space that you don't even understand because you don't know it exists. And so it can be very, very difficult to break into that. Then there's also news networks with common ownership, right? And so these are the problems where decisions are made in Toronto, and you have to compete with, as I say, national news again, even though if it feels like it should be local. And then there's also CBC multi-platform news. And so that means you might have an intern writing the online stuff. You might have a radio story that never hits online. So you may have heard this amazing story in the morning and then it's totally gone. You can't even get a copy of it after. That's because of how CBC has been increasingly making its multi-platform news. It's also a disaster. And these are the jobs where the people are like the lowest paid, the lowest in the newsroom, the most precarious, and who are expected to pump out like 2 or 3 stories an hour, a day, 2, 3 stories, 5 stories a day. And so if your story is complicated or requires more work, it might just get passed by because there's just no time to do it. So one thing that's really, really important to know is who owns what and what are their political orientations. Will you have more success trying to get space in the Winnipeg Free Press than in the Winnipeg Sun? The answer is yes. Is the coverage is going to be more sympathetic? Yes, in the Free Press than the Sun. But even then, understand the ecosystem that you're operating in. You can always look at election endorsements and editorial positions that they take to give you an idea, and then get a sense of what the high profile columnists or the talking heads are saying. They're going to skew to the right. They're going to skew to the anti-union, but they often reflect where the editorial position of the organization is at. And if you know that they're hostile to you, you're going to have to change your media strategy to work around that. There's also racial, class, and gender biases, right? And so if you've got like who is going to be more likely to be taken seriously when they're speaking on behalf of your union? Are you going to be ignored because you've got spokespeople who are not white or spokespeople who are not male? It's not a justification for changing those spokespeople, but you have to be aware that these biases are going to mean that it might be harder for you to get a comment in the news than otherwise. And so what you have to do is strategize. How do we get around these institutional biases? Or in this case, this is not really something that's playing a role. So, do the mapping that's necessary to understand the media ecosystem. And so, your ownership, I've already talked about too. You got Global, that's owned by Shock Chorus. CTV is owned by Bell, by BCE. You got the National Post and the Winnipeg Free Press, both going to have the same content in them from Post Media. And, again, all of these organizations have political ideology that tend to be anti-worker, right? I mean, the founder of the Globe and Mail was stabbed to death at his desk by a worker after a historic strike that created the 8-hour workday, right? So, rest in peace, I guess, George Brown. But these are long-seated biases sometimes. And so, again, it doesn't mean that you have no hope. It doesn't mean that you have no chance. It means you have to be very strategic when you're trying to figure out how to interact with mainstream press. So here are some challenges that journalists are facing. They lack knowledge about issues, broadly speaking, like in general, and they lack the technical knowledge. In a situation of a strike, it is so bad. There is no industrial relations training. There is I went to journalism school. I can tell you, it is shocking how nothing journalists learn about the world of labor, like nothing at all. So you are working against this massive wave of ignorance, even if there's goodwill there. And that means you have to do a lot of education, right? What's the difference between a strike and a lockout? Well, are you fighting for things that are very specific to the university that then you have to vulgarize, you have to explain in common language for journalists? That's a real barrier. And because of that barrier, the university administration knows that they can snow journalists over with their authority and with their confidence of what they're talking about, right? So it can feel really, really tough, but then you just kind of have to send them a clip of the Lisa Simpson singing in front of the power plant when they're on strike, right? They are the plant, but we have the power, right? And that kind of sentiment is not that far from journalists ever, if they're average journalists. Sometimes there's real right-wing ones among them, but most of them are, they're good, right? They're average people, right? They also often search to have multiple people comment on the same topic, which can be a real problem during a strike because you have one or maybe a few spokespeople, and journalists sometimes are like, oh, we already talked to them. It's like, they are the spokesperson. That's who you talk to. And then the journalist is like, no, but you don't understand. We need to have many voices. We don't want to just have one voice. Do your members even agree with you? And so that means that the union has to have a lot of members who are ready to talk to journalists just as average members, not speaking on behalf of the union, which can be really difficult when negotiations are intense, when a lot's on the line, when you can't have anyone, misspeak, or else it turns into a thing, right? So that can be a bit of a challenge. And as journalists, I mean, this is maybe place specific, so you'll really know if on the morning radio, morning CBC show, if you hear the same voices all the time. But certainly, like in my tiny world of CBC Quebec City, they hate talking to the same person more than once. And that causes a lot of problems when there's a protracted kind of issue where you have to talk to the same person many times. And then one of the challenges is that they have faith in government, they have faith in power, which unfortunately means they have natural faith in your administration. And so there's a lot of, you're starting again from behind to be like, well, why would they do that to you? Why would they expect you to do, like, that doesn't make any sense. It's like, no, it's because they actually, they don't care about us, right? What do you mean they don't care? Of course they care about you. No, that's not how the management works. So you have to kind of poke holes in like this idea of power being benevolent. And again, that's going to come through the way that you talk about these issues and the way that your communication strategy is created. And so they've got this lack of understanding of anything deeper than a wading pool, mostly because they're generalists and they're writing about lots of different topics all at the same time. They have time and word constraints, right? So, this is very basic. If you miss a journalist's deadline, you're not going to get as much play in a story than as if you were like right away responding to their calls. That has an impact on coverage. They also have word constraints. And so if you have a comment that is too long, the comment's going to get cut. It doesn't matter if it's the most eloquent thing that's ever been said in the world, it's going to get cut because they've got word constraints. So you have to keep that in mind, that might feel like it's working against you, but it's just the constraints that they're operating under. I just did an article for Chatelaine, a long feature. I have tons of words, a 5,000 word feature. And the most important thing that the personal care worker who I interviewed said, I couldn't get into the piece because it was just too off of the focus. And so that's often, even with the goodwill of journalists, something that you have to, keep in mind. If it bleeds, it leads. This is a common mantra within newsrooms. And as they said earlier, if you have breaking news and it knocks you off the front page, there's nothing you can do about it. And so you have to anticipate breaking news bumping you off of the front page. That just has to be part of your expectation, unfortunately. And then there's personal interest in a particular story. Sometimes journalists just don't really care about labor relations, and that can be really challenging because if there's only 20 journalists and 3 of them are like, I really don't care about this, that automatically limits who's going to be able to write about these issues. And that also is going to be outside of your hands. Then there's new challenges that we're all facing. There's fake news. There's new news sources that skew right wing. There's virility in Facebook groups, and there's clickbait. Now, the nice thing about these new challenges is that you also can use some of these issues into your strategy. So if you can think of somehow that the strike is fighting for, I don't know, academic freedom so that professors can fight against fake news without being worried about what management is saying, that is automatically a hook that might be interesting to a journalist. If you're doing things that seem a bit more clickbaity, or using memes, or using new kinds of platforms that are fun and unexpected for professors, you might earn journalism, you might earn news just out of doing something that's out of the ordinary. It's very frustrating that you can have a whole media strategy and the thing that they want to talk to you about is the bison running off of the coat of arms meme. But at the end of the day, if it gets you news, it gets you news, right? And so you do have to think outside the box. And I've got some tips on how to do that in a bit. So there's different kinds of media intervention. And during a strike, because it's on one side versus the other side, you're going to want to think of how do you use these other kinds of media intervention to get your message in there. So expert comment. they'll always want to talk to industrial relations people or other maybe faculty associations or other people who have been in a similar spot who aren't speaking on the union's behalf, but who can explain why is the fight for, academic freedom or smaller classes or whatever, why is it important? So make sure you have people lined up, and those people could be they could be members who are industrial relations professors. They also could be completely outside, right? Oh, industrial relations professor from University of Saskatchewan says blah, blah, blah. But if you line up expert comment that a journalist can rely on, you get your message into the same article maybe twice or another time because you actually have other people saying what you want them to say. There's always someone promoting something. And so, that also could be a way to try and get different kinds of media interventions, that maybe you're promoting something, but the strike is making it impossible to happen. So, the university management and their inaction has halted this important research something or other. Might be an interesting hook as well. And then there's, of course, speaking on behalf of something. That would be obviously the core work that your union communications folks are doing. And then there's the streeter, which is, as I said, when a journalist just kind of sticks a microphone in your face. And I suspect that most people on the call, that might be the streeter kind of interventions that you might be making. And so if that's the case, know that a really solid streeter from a seemingly random person will get them interested. That will actually probably break it through onto the news or into the radio, because, we're always surprised as journalists when you kind of run into a random person and they've got something really powerful to say. So it's something that you will all want to be prepared for in case that opportunity happens. And so there's two key ways to get your message out. And during a strike, you're using both. So you've got being on the offensive when you're going to create or generate news for the news outlet or for social media. And so that means, every time you have a strike vote, every time you have a rally, every time you have something going on that is being on the offensive, you want your message out and you want journalists to call you because you're saying this is happening. This is what we're coordinating. Then there's on the defensive, which is when you're called without warning by a journalist saying, well, the university just said that you rejected the last offer. And you're like, what the hell are you talking about? We have not. And then all of a sudden you're doing kind of defensive work. It's a different kind of interview and you have a lot less control, but you're also a lot more important to the story. So we're on the offensive. You might not be able to convince someone that your story is important enough to cover. The defensive means they're calling you, and that means you're going to be in that story. And so you have to be prepared for both. And regardless of what it is, you have to try and outspin your opponents. You have to understand what they're going to say about you. You're going to have to know what you're saying about them. You're going to have to think about what they're saying about themselves. And then you always want that conversation to go back to what you're saying about yourselves. Why is this strike from your perspective about X, Y, Z? And why is management completely incorrect? This is usually where I then go into how to do interviews. So if you're, as I say, curious about that, you can be in touch with me later on. So actually, I should stop there to see if there's any questions.
There's a couple. I think, Bala, you've got your hand raised. You want to go ahead?
Okay. I'm a senior faculty member, and I do have some more freedom than many others. I think one of the stuff that I'm beginning to see why the media is not focusing very much is there are issues that are much more punchy. Like, for example, if you have definite knowledge that the university is making per day this many $1 million and not wanting to give it back to the faculty who would come back and do the job, or if we have a certain information that they are making $15 million per year and they have this much in the bank, and if we are very sure this is what the public would get provoked by the media if we are quite confident about these news. Same way, how many sessional instructors being paid $6,000 per course versus paying more money to have a professor teach? If you have hard facts this is what will get the media going much faster. And the public is not interested in listening whether we are going to ask for 1.5% or 1.8%. They think we are all greedy. Professors are greedy, or they are just lazy bums, don't work more than 6 months. But these financial facts should be given to the public through the media. And I don't know how.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That journalists are looking for those punchy facts. And they're also, I think the public is interested too, in like actually understanding what a professor is, right? I mean, those ideas that a professor does, only work 6 months of the year, has these cushy jobs or whatever. I mean, I don't imagine there's a single person on this call that like has had more than 7 hours of sleep in the last, like, since you were hired, right? Like there's a lot of education that needs to be done to, I think, really demystify how professors, like, what their lives actually are. And then critically, the amazing research that you're doing, right? Like this is a little bit aside, but during a strike, like it's one thing to use the media to bargain, which is a strategy, and it's a completely fine strategy, but it is a strategy that sometimes can go poorly. So it's something you really have to debate, right? And internally have an idea about. But when you're trying to build support for professors, there's the two ways to do it. There's shaming parts of the university, like, there's a ton of financial ways that you can make the argument that the university has the money, they're making money, they're hiding these things. I was at Ryerson for 10 years. Like I saw all of that while I was at the Board of Governors and the Senate, and I know it's the same everywhere else. And then you have the humanity side, showing the side of professors, showing like COVID-19 is the big issue right now. What is this strike stopping by way of people doing research on infectious disease or on, rural outbreaks or on Indigenous healthcare, like things that people really care about. And so thinking less about getting the bargaining positions into the press, but getting more the support for the faculty through the stories of who the faculty is, that's going to be a lot more interesting for the press. And then it doesn't matter what you're asking for, because no, you're not asking the average person to debate your salary increases. You're asking the average person to put pressure on the university to treat you with respect, and they feel like you're not being treated with respect. So it's a really good way to have that hook. And I'm going to talk a little bit about creating those media hooks too. So, anything else? Yeah, Orby?
Yeah, two that are sort of related. They're both about social media. The first is about how can we leverage social media in ways that leverage our issues and that are meaningful, but without being mean-spirited. And then similarly, how do we get to a broader audience than just the people who regularly follow us?
Great. Okay. So those two questions, I'm going to hold off on them because I'm going to touch on a lot of them. And then I think the social media piece is a really big one. So we'll come back to that when the presentation's finished.
Okay. And then the last one was, is there a way to be proactive against the administration? They have access to the all employees, all students email list, so they can get their message out in ways that we cannot.
Yeah.
So are there ways that we can, how do we participate against that?
Yeah, that's really hard. The only good news is that nobody reads administration emails, right? Like students included. So they have a lot of power and they have a lot of tools in their arsenal, but finding ways to get your message out. I mean, it's not just the media. And that is something that you have to keep in mind, that as much as being in the press on your issues is really great because you get a wide, variety of people talking about it, it's not the most important, especially because who's watching media anymore, like that's changing. And that's where social media becomes really important. And social media itself sometimes becomes the story, right? Where you actually will have some sort of, funny video, and then the story is about the video rather than your negotiations. Like that's kind of the reality of where we're at right now, even if we hate it. And I can say I kind of hate it. But finding other ways to reach people, that's kind of a basic kind of communications committee debate, right? There's flyering, there's picket information lines, there's going to other spaces within Winnipeg that people hang out at and trying to talk, person to person that way. There is building your own email list, which I'm sure you've been working on for a long time. There's letters to the editor, right? There's a lot of ways that you can get your message out that doesn't rely on actually being accepted by journalists. You have those kinds of things, put out to the world. So there are some options, but I don't think that we should be too worried that an email from the admin is going to change like students' minds. You do need to have the solidarity though, hopefully, and I'm sure you have conversations about this, but solidarity with student groups that are sympathetic and making sure that they're also doing what's possible to make sure that students are present in the discussions. And then joint student faculty events can be very attractive for journalists as well, because a journalist might see, well, aren't you using students as pawns? And it's like, well, students are with us at this barbecue, or students are actually, today's the student picket line, right? Tomorrow's the staff picket line or something like this, that just will show that there's more support that otherwise might be demonstratable, because just don't see it, right? Okay, so technical considerations. I've already mentioned deadlines. Deadlines are key. If you miss a deadline, you're not in the story. And sometimes, if a committee is not sure about who's going to respond to this and a media request falls through the cracks, then you've kind of lost your chance at a story. So you have to make sure that you're responding very quickly. And you have to know, publication dates and assignment days, editorial meetings. It's at the editorial meetings where they actually decide what the news of the day is going to be. And so if you don't know when the editorial meeting is for CBC morning radio or afternoon radio, it's really important for you to find that out, because it's that day that your story would be pitched. And so it's usually like the day before when they're planning the afternoon show or they're planning the next morning show. So you have to make sure that if you have a journalist connection, it's like, can you pitch this at tomorrow's story meeting to make sure that, we're in the discussion. And so knowing that is really, really helpful. And if you don't know, like, that's where you talk to journalists and say, when do your stories get assigned? When do you have these discussions? There's no shame at all in asking those kinds of questions. It shows that you actually know a little bit about how the system works, and that the struggles and pressure that they're under. Then also, make sure you're communicating with reporters the way that they want to be communicated with. A lot of them are going to be on Twitter, right? So if you have to direct message people, if you email them or text them, depending on what they want to be contacted with, it's a good way to stay in touch with journalists. And you can always be in touch with people just as a pleasant hello. We're a part of the same community kind of thing. You don't always have to be fishing for a story. In fact, you shouldn't always be fishing for a story, right? You want to build those relationships. I've already mentioned breaking news, and I've already mentioned the decisions that get made from afar. So here are 11 tips, and that's going to be the rest of this presentation. Number one, produce technical information, make it understandable for lay people. This is critical for your bargaining demands. This is also critical, just as was suggested, to come up with some tips or some information about the university that journalists can rely on very easily, right? This should be an easily searchable page that just has quick facts about the strike. And so a journalist writing about this, if they have to look more than 3 minutes for this information, they might not even just include it. And so, for example, when I was writing at the beginning of the pandemic about long-term care in Canada, it was impossible to find a left-wing source to tell me things like per resident funding, our average hours of care per day, like really basic things that I know the unions have. So make sure you have this information, put it publicly, share it with people, encourage people to write about it on social media. It's a way to get your members to be involved and let people know. And then also when you post a piece of information, and if you can see a whole discussion underneath is like really interesting, you know when you've hit a really good note of what people are outraged about. And then you can figure out, okay, that's actually landing with average people. Let's try to pitch that to media because it might land with them as well. Tip 2, again, you have to make sure your media strategy is not impacted if news breaks and you're off of the front page. So if your entire success was wrapped up in getting journalists at an event and they don't show up, you have to have another way to measure success, because you cannot guarantee that journalists will show up. So keep that in mind. It isn't because necessarily they hate you. I mean, it might be in very few circumstances, but the majority of them do not. It's going to be because there's other pressures on them. And so make sure you're using your rallies in other ways to not just have, oh, it was a failure because the journalist didn't show up. You can't expect them to show up. And if they do, it's like gravy, right? It's not like, oh, it was a success. It was more like, it was a success and we poured gravy all over it. This is awesome. Tip 3. Do you have a consistent point person for media relations? That person has to form relationships with journalists. It's really, really important. That's the person that might text a journalist at night and be like, hey, FYI, something's happening tomorrow. Or FYI, university just made a decision, an offer, it sucks, or whatever, right? Having that kind of personal relationship with a journalist is really, really important, because then you'll also understand how they operate, what they like, what they're not interested in at all. And in some cases, they might help you place your stories if they think it's a good story, but you don't know where to place it. They'll suggest it to another journalist, or sometimes they'll suggest it to a different outlet. Okay, tip 4, do the legwork for journalists. If they ask if they need something, this is really great if you're looking for expert comment. So if you're doing an interview with them and they're like, they say something and you say, you know what, you might actually benefit from hearing from an industrial relations expert. We've got a CRC in industrial relations from Toronto. Do you want his phone number? You can ask him these questions. Like, they'll say yes. Like, journalists go from source to source to source, and they will absolutely say yes. And again, this doesn't, and you can say to them, oh, like, they're not part of our strike, but this is a person that writes about, you know, strikes and faculty strikes specifically. Like, give them a call and see if you can get some interesting information from them. Have a list of people that you can refer to journalists, so that you start to fill out the people that they're talking to, because the university is obviously doing that, right? So you might as well also try to do that whenever you have that chance, and have a multilingual media strategy. I assume you have a whole Franco crew that's on Radio Canada as much as possible. If you do not have that, you need that, because all minority language media need people who speak their language to do media. And you will find that in what's called the ethnic media. So anything that's not English, if you have someone that speaks that language, make sure that you've connected them to the media outlet, because there's a lot of multi-ethnic media in Winnipeg that would, I'm sure, be very happy to hear from someone speaking in their language, being able to talk about what the strike is like, what like being a professor is like, and blah, blah, blah. So that's a really key one. And that's also something the university will not be thinking of. So it's a way to reach other communities who might not be reading, you know, the free or listening to CBC. Tip 5, always reply immediately to journalists. This is so important. And so even if you're like, what kind of media request is this? Take the call, say you'll do it, ask how much time they have, or call them right back if you need to prepare, right? Don't do an interview cold. You can say, oh, I did this today, actually. Someone asked me to do an interview on something that I think will be a disaster, but I was just like, whatever, who cares? But I'm like, oh, I have to change my shirt. And so I didn't, but I was able to just like prepare myself for this interview, and there I did. I mean, I was wearing this literally. So you'll see if it ends up on CBC. Yeah, always say yes, because admin is always going to say yes. And then if you always say yes, you become a consistent source, a solid source that they know that if they can call you in a pinch, they will. And then all of a sudden you'll find yourself more and more being asked to comment on stuff, because they know that you'll call them back, because nothing a journalist hates more than people that don't return their calls. Tip 6, you have to think like a journalist. So this is, you have to know that the journalist has to advocate for your issue in the way that you're advocating for your issue to the journalist. They have to advocate to their boss to say, this is a story that matters. They don't have to agree with it or anything like that. But if they can't convince their boss that this matters to the community that they serve, then the story will not run. So you have to be able to convince someone who's completely outside of the institution, completely outside of the strike, why this matters to the average person. Sometimes this takes role playing, sometimes it takes debating internally, but you'll come up with the best way to explain why this matters to this community, why this matters because of this kind of research, why this matters because of the institution itself and its role within cultural, economic production of the city or the province or whatever. But you have to get good enough at convincing someone else that they then have the skills to convince someone else that this is worth covering. Tip 7 is kind of similar to the question that was asked. So find alternative ways to get your message out. This is increasingly blogs and columns and features, right? Places like The Conversation, which is specifically set up for faculty members. Blogs, like, you know, setting up your own blog right now is definitely a good idea. The nice thing about blogs is that you can share them online, and they're shareable just like a free press story. And so if you've got a nice punchy blog post that then actually travels on social media, it's just as good as having a letter to the editor, right? Or something like that. So, you know, make sure that you have those alternative outlets to be able to get these stories out, and that you're always seeking for new ways to get that message out. Okay, tip 8, don't think too hard about being reasonable or unreasonable. So journalists report on the sides of an issue, not in the way that they think that there's reasonableness and unreasonableness. They're literally just reporting on two sides. And this goes back to the ignorance about industrial relations, right? And so, if like, you're not being blocked because journalists think that you're being unreasonable. If you're being blocked or not being covered, it's because they don't care about the strike in general. And then your job is to make them care about the strike. So I think that, oftentimes it's like, we're very concerned, like we don't want to come across as being angry. We don't want to come across as being radical, or we don't want to come across as being some sort of negative thing that will stop us from getting positive coverage. The reality is that you're in a fight that's very, very important for you. It's so important that you've stopped working. And in a democratic society, when people withdraw their labor, that is a sign that things are really bad and really important. So like, the level of what is reasonable or unreasonable no longer matters. What matters is that you're out there, you're putting yourself on the line, and you're passionately defending something. I think that people right now are really starved for that passion and authenticity of defending something, defending anything right now, because things feel so fake and weird and we're all disconnected from each other. And if they can see the passion and the importance in your struggle, you will get support. You will get people on your side. You just have to figure out what the best way to transmit that is. And it's going to be different from print. You're going to do a different kind of interview. For TV, it has to be super visual. That's going to look different. Radio can be a little bit more cerebral, and because it's right into someone's ears. You can talk right directly to them. But it isn't a question of being unreasonable. It's not going to ruin your media coverage. They're not gauging which side is reasonable, unreasonable. That's like too high level for too many journalists. Okay, and tip 9, look out for alternative possibilities, as I said, with other options outside of media entirely, right? Allied students who can talk to journalists. You can experiment with TikTok. I mean, that's a bit risky because obviously if you do it badly, then you look like Elizabeth May from a couple of years ago, and no one wants that. I mean, you might even be a fan, but I mean, check out that TikTok. It's not good. There's call-in shows, so make sure that you're on top of when people are talking about the strike. And the reality of strikes is that there's like a moment where they're on long enough that it becomes news, and then they go on even longer than that and they fall out of being news. And so you have to figure out like where in the strike cycle you are, and really push hard to make sure that like even on a call-in show would be about your issues, right? And so then you get people ready, and they're able to call in, and they're all positive or whatever. But this is where social media plays a really important role. So I imagine you have a social media team. I imagine that there's debates internally about what to do there. Target only women on Facebook. That's one of the ways that the BC Teachers Federation realized that they got rid of almost all of the hateful comments. Men got the posts anyway, but when they specifically targeted women, somehow all of the hateful comments disappeared from their posts, which is very interesting. So there are like some tips like that you can kind of help game the algorithm, because the algorithm is so oriented towards making people really angry all the time. But this is where you can like really show the humanity of your members, of yourselves, of like talking about the research that you do and how it's all on hold and why is it on hold? Why is this so important? You can talk directly to people through videos. You can talk directly to people through Twitter. And so that's something that everybody, if everybody on this call is all of a sudden turning Winnipeg Twitter into a nonstop discussion about the strike, you create another hook for journalists to talk about this, because all of a sudden they're going to see it in their media, in their news feeds a lot more. And in something like that, it snowballs. So make sure you're all networked into each other. You're retweeting each other too. That amplifies this, and then make sure it's in other people's feeds as well. And I think Twitter is going to be your best bet. Instagram might be useful as well. But these are going to be the platforms that are going to reach people probably the easiest, because of the kind of people who are on Twitter, and because that's where journalists are.
Orvie, I can't raise my hand because I'm a co-host, but I have a question.
Wait, why don't we just wait till we're through the tips, Juliet, and then we can do some questions.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 more tips. So we're almost there. Okay, create a news hook. As I said, a strike is not necessarily news to a journalist, even though it's like totally news for you. So you have to give them the peg. What is the reason they're going to come out? Is it the rally, or is it that the rally is going to do something like block a road, or like hang a giant banner, or like have a big human pyramid cheerleading squad? Like there has to be something that gets a journalist excited. And so when you start to think about that in your actions, then you can, oh, okay, that's how we go on the offensive to get journalists to come out here. It can be very tiring to always think like this, but you know, there are things like a new vote, a new contract offer, new sets of talks. Those are the news pegs more than just, you know, having an event that's kind of in the normal course of the strike. And tip 11, you have to make it so they cannot ignore you. This is how average people have to engage with the press. When we do not own the press, when we do not have power over what the press covers, you have to make it so they cannot ignore you. And sometimes that means you might be doing something where you'd be like, whoa, that seems kind of aggressive. But you have to, because if you try to play nice, like you're pretending that this is some sort of game that you have any power in. Again, when the owners are going to write about the strike in a negative way, nothing you do is going to change their minds, because they are politically motivated to crush organizing. A lot of times it's because they don't want their own staff to organize, right? So you have to make it so they cannot ignore you. And there's escalating ways to do that. But there are also a lot of fun ways to do that as well, to make videos that go viral, or to make memes that go viral, or make it so that their social media feeds are full of people, you know, always talking about the strike. And then all of a sudden they're like, okay, wow, this is a big deal. So you have to think of it in those terms. Do something or have a campaign that is so unignorable that they have to cover what you're talking about. So that is it. There's my email address. You all are totally free to email me. You can say if you hated this presentation or loved it or whatever, or if you have other questions, but there is obviously some time now. So I am totally happy to take any questions that people have.
Yeah, maybe just before questions, I can just provide some assurances to our members that maybe we're like, just so they don't have to all 127 of you send an email being like, Orby, have you done this? Have you done that? I can do this, I can do that. A whole bunch of stuff that we've done here, or that you've outlined here, that's exactly what the comms team that we've hired and that we have on our staff have been doing. And they're here today and like taking notes, and I know picking up some tips too, but they also just messaged me and were like, oh, this is exactly what we do. And as someone totally new to this whole world during our strike, it's been fascinating to learn how these things go too. The Dan Lett article, there was it was opinion piece in the Free Press on the weekend, and all day our team was like on the phone with Dan and steering him in a different direction and feeding him like a, breaking like insider scoop. Dan, this is, and then it came out and it was pretty darn good for us and was way better than the idea that he'd had himself unsolicited. So just to members thinking like, oh my gosh, are we doing this, or we should do this? We are doing a whole bunch of it. But we also brought you here because it's not like I'm saying we're experts. We're definitely here for some feedback. And I know we've got a whole team that they are doing a virtual picketing duties. So they've been very active on social media. So they're, I think, especially very keen to hear some input. So Juliet has a question, and then there's one other one from the chat. Go ahead.